And so I just turned on the record, so I guess we're rolling here. I wanted to start by
So boring.
topics lined out, and I wanted to remind you that we have a quiz Wednesday. And so it's going to be like the other quizzes. I'll give it to you and you'll work on it. I'll give an extended time for you to finish them up. And that'll be that. I'll grade them after they're all in. And as you guys already know, no more on-campus meetings after Wednesday. When we have our Thanksgiving break, nobody comes back to campus. What happens is that we will go virtual for the last 2 weeks. One of those weeks will be you guys giving these presentations. And so I would encourage you to finish those up this week so that you're not trying to track down people in your class who've gone home for the break. And so, this looks like a pretty good list of what I'm asking you to do. I got a couple of changes I want to tell you about. First of all, is that instead of 10 minutes, I'm going to lower that down to a 7-minute presentation. Give you a little bit more flexibility. It should be enough time to do a presentation, a thorough presentation, and we'll be able to get more of them in after we come back from Thanksgiving break. And so that goes to 7 minutes. And a quiz on Wednesday. The quiz on Wednesday is going to have to do with your presentation, by the way. So, that being said, I'd like to start talking to you guys about Gothic art. And it's basically the way they have this divided up, Gothic Europe north of the Alps. And in part, that distinction has to do with south of the Alps is Italy. And Italy kind of takes a slightly different course in terms of its artistic development and its architectural evolution, which leads to the Italian Renaissance beginning in about 1400. So anyway, here we go. I'm going to start with the map again. And just making sure, yeah. Holy Roman Empire, the Papal States. We got Spain and Portugal. This is around 1200. Still kind of divided, but mostly the Islamic part is kind of pushed to the south. France becomes its own kingdom, England, Ireland, and so on. So these maps start to look a little bit more like modern day Europe. And so I wanted to start with this. This is actually the first slide, the first image in chapter 13, and it's the Abbey Church at Saint Denis, France. And it is it's kind of the prototype for what we see in Gothic art, which is mostly centered around the church and everything, the illustrated manuscripts, the stained glass, the sculpture, the architecture for sure, all revolves around the church. And so when I told you guys, when I assigned that presentation, I talked about power and belief systems and why artwork looks the way it does. And I've been trying to, for this whole semester, to try to kind of get that in of why things look the way they do. What do they tell us about the society? And in Gothic Europe, it does tell us the church is everything. Christianity is not just a belief system, but it's an integral part of everyday life. It's an integral part of the government. It's an integral part of the military and politics and economics and so on. And so this is Saint Denis. Anybody know about Saint Denis? Or if you say it in English, Dennis? I'm not hearing anything. Saint Denis, until about 100 years ago, was considered to be the patron saint of France. That title has gone to Joan of Arc, but still a very significant figure in Christianity in France. And Saint Denis was the bishop of Paris when Paris was part of the Roman Empire. And so Saint Denis goes way far back, and he was bishop of Paris when Christianity was not tolerated in the Roman Empire. And so as such, Saint Denis was executed. He was one of the early martyrs in the Christian church. And one of the things that we find here is that martyrdom is really venerated. It's really highly esteemed in this Christian culture. And so he was a martyr, but his martyrdom was a little unique. Here's a picture, here's something from an illustrated manuscript. And here is a statue, Saint Denis. What do you notice about this?
He is decapitated, and that is not normal for to be depicted like that.
Absolutely not normal. And so we talk a lot about why these things are depicted like they are, but Saint Denis was like there in the 3rd, 4th century. And this is like 700, 800 years later. But he was the bishop, and that's why he has the bishop's mitre with all of the jewels, and you see that over here too. And that is contemporary 12th century bishop clothing. Chances were, when Saint Denis was alive, there wasn't really this kind of elaborate dress, costume. And in fact, probably more like a regular person or probably even a peasant. And so anyway, this is kind of, 12th century bishop's clothes. But that gets to the decapitated part. You might say he lost his head. Just say, which he did. That's how he was executed. That was his martyrdom. The Romans got him and they cut his head off. Bend over, big sword, swoop, cut his head off. And so what Saint Denis did at that point was pick up his head and start walking away. And that's why he's pictured holding his head. And he started walking, and he walked somewhere around like maybe 20 miles from where he was executed to this spot, and he sat down under a tree and he died. And that is where this was built. And so it's one of the early cathedrals, and Saint Denis, and here you can, who are these guys? Well, I'm kind of thinking angels. Typically angels as female. And see, here's some of the other Christians that were decapitated too, by the way. But Saint Denis picked it up, sat down. So he's always portrayed holding his head. And so anyway, what we have here in terms of the architecture and the sculpture, they almost all merge into one thing. As I was saying, the government, the monetary system, the government, the military, everyday life dominated by the church. And so that's why you see this magnificent blossoming of cathedrals all over Europe at this time in the Gothic period. And as such, almost everything that's artistic goes right to the church too. And so this is a jam statue, which is right at the entryway, and they would have sculpture along the entryway to remind you of who the holy people are and what this church is all about. Here's an ambulatory, and we talked about that. That is a walkway around the backside of the church, as we talked about, a prayer ambulatory. But something I liked about this picture is that we see stained glass. And so stained glass is very prominent in Gothic cathedrals. And it still is in some churches, still use a lot of stained glass. But bottom line, and it's used for a lot of different purposes. Sometimes it's purely decorative, and it's supposed to symbolize the light of God coming through and illuminating this place. Sometimes it tells a story, and you see these little vignettes, these little scenes of various parts of the Gospels, or sometimes from the Old Testament. And as such, and this is such a good picture because this shows the kind of skill, the kind of technology, if you will, used to create these cathedrals. And so, yeah, we see the ribbed, pointed vaults. And you can see, in this case, lots of brickwork. And I'll talk about why that became brickwork in just a moment. And they don't particularly go for a particular order when they do their columns and they do their capitals here. They're mostly unique. And this is exceptionally lightweight vaults spring from the slender columns. So how are they able to do this? And here is Saint Denis, and they have the columns, and here is the ambulatory that we just saw. Well, part of the reason they're able to do that is that they come up with, I'm going to get a good picture of this. Chartres Cathedral. I hear a dog. Good puppy. These things right here, these are called flying buttresses, and they help hold the weight of the ceiling, and they help take a lot of stress off the walls. And when you take the stress off the walls and you got these things holding up the ceiling, you don't need the walls to be quite as strong, which allows you to have these huge gaping holes here, there, which you can fill with stained glass. And so it's all kind of merged in together. Here is the plan for the Chartres Cathedral, and you see it's done in the shape of a cross. Here's a picture from the front, from the entrance, the west facade. And so this area up here, I want to tell you about. This is called a transept. And transepts are they're really just a space above a doorway. And if you've been in old houses or old buildings, interior transepts, they're kind of common, and they're just like a big window above the door, which allows for the flow of air from one room to the next. But in this case, a transept, because it's not supporting weight, you can set in a big, huge stained glass. And so I have the star on this one, partly because a lot of people talk about Chartres as being maybe one of the premier cathedrals in Gothic France. And you'll see this is looking east, and this is what this looks like from the inside. You can see the brickwork up there, and you can see the stained glass. And around the sides, you'd see a lot of stained glass. You see an altar, and so on. St. Theodore, jam statue in front of the left portal of the Porch of the Martyrs, south transept. And so these are the kinds of statues that you would encounter on your way into a Gothic cathedral. And they're not just statues. They all have their own particular iconography based on the lives of these saints. And so this is a warrior saint, you can tell. Got the chainmail, got the spear, got the sword, got angels and other seraphim holding him up. It's like these places, here we go. These places are huge. They're pretty much unlike anything we'd seen. And a lot of these cathedrals sort of, quote, hold the record for being among the tallest and largest buildings in the world. That changes in the 19th and 20th centuries, to be sure. But, and again, talking about iconography, who would this be? Right here. Jesus, of course. He's got the Bible, he's given a blessing, it's got the cross, halo, he's enthroned, he's royal, and he's center, and he's higher up than all these other figures in this composition. But they don't leave anything they hardly leave any space to waste, because everything is carved, everything is decorated. It's all about telling stories. This is, I'm going to zoom in on this. And so, what might this be? Burial of Christ, the apostles and Mary and Mary Magdalene and so on. Just saying. Everything is there to tell a story. And that's why just prior to this, in the late medieval, we start to see the emergence of sculptors that are very adept at telling stories when much of the population was basically illiterate. And so you would get much of the entire Bible, much of the important parts of the faith illustrated for you as you arrive. Stonemasons and sculptors, detail a stained glass window in the northernmost radiating chapel in the ambulatory Chartres Cathedral. And so this is really kind of an interesting thing. Here they are carving door jamb statues here, stonemasons, and so it was kind of a group collective. We don't see like what we were seeing in the late medieval period of actually having people, the artists, sign their work. And in fact, what we have is a shift in the religion, in the ideology, if you will, that basically people were on earth to glorify God. And so they weren't there to really glorify themselves. So they would work on these statues and stuff, and we still don't know really who did what in that case. But you can see this is kind of an interesting thing because it's a big block of stone, and he's breaking it down, carving the detail on the right. And so anyway, there are people, it's been said, that these would work on Gothic cathedrals, and sometimes these cathedrals would take a long time to build. And so it didn't matter. It didn't matter if you were doing it as an old person or a young person, or if you'd even lived to see the end of its final construction. Everybody's purpose was to serve God. And building a cathedral was one of the best ways to do that. And so this is in the transept of the Chartres Cathedral, that area I was telling you about here. And it's called the Rose Window, and it's a name that people have placed on this. But bottom line is that it's huge. And you can kind of get parts of this. this dove. This will start appearing a lot in the iconography, and then that is the Holy Spirit. That's something that we don't see so much of before. And let me show you this. This is the Madonna and Child. We've seen that. We've seen that before, and this will persist. As a matter of fact, in French Catholicism, they have a very revered and special place for Mary, the mother of Christ. And so this image becomes really central in a lot of the artwork associated with the cathedrals, and even the names of some of the cathedrals. Notre Dame, which is a high woman. Some more jam statues and sculpture on sculpture on sculpture. One of the things they talk about in art history about Gothic cathedral sculpture is that a lot of this is kind of formulaic, which is understandable. We've seen formulaic art emerge in the Byzantine period. That's how the iconography stayed stable for all of those centuries. And here we're talking about style, but it's basically, you get these kinds of just these vertical lines and this kind of activity to represent cloth. Now, it doesn't really give you a good idea of what's under the cloth. It was just basically stylized. It's not nearly as developed as what we saw in, say, ancient Greece and Rome, where the clothing seemed to conform to the body. This is mostly static, mostly stiff. And in terms of facial expressions, they're mostly pretty stoic. They're holy people. They may look at you. They may have something of a smile, but it's basically the same all over. And so Saints Jerome, Martin, Gregory, again, something a little more sophisticated, but not nearly what we see in, say, like Hellenistic Greece. And so the iconography suited to the person being depicted, their status in the church, what they did in their lifetimes. And so anyway, that is France. And what we see is that this kind of architecture starts to spread basically all over Europe. And so we have this transept, stained glass. We see the portals and the jam statues, and it's kind of the same formula put together in a different way. And this is from Lyon, France. I'm sorry, I said it was Spain. But as you get closer to Spain, you find the differences in the culture. They start to stand out. The Lyon Cathedral, again, folding chairs, keep saying it. And so I got this, wanted to show you. get me my ads off there. I got to make sure you're seeing that. Yeah, good. One of the most famous of all of them was the Cathedral of Notre Dame. I was telling you just a moment ago about how the Mary, the Mother of God, was so revered, especially in France. This is that cathedral. And here's the story about it. April 15, 2019, the night of the great Notre Dame fire. We're watching disbelief and sorrow. The medieval cathedral that radiated immortality hovered on the edge of destruction. And yet, by the early hours of the next morning, the stone structure stood tall. All of the firefighters survived. And so, this is basically the story of what happened, and it's on the link is there. And so, let me see. There we go. And let me see if you're seeing this. You are. Good. So this is what it looked like before it caught fire. And it was a central part of Paris. Notre Dame and the Eiffel Tower, probably the two most prominent, most historic sites in Paris. And I want you to kind of pull this out. See, we have this transept stained glass right here. You see, this is 1163. So basically, this is really highly developed. And the spires, much decorated. And you see these things. And I love this picture because you see these flying buttresses. They are there to help hold up the roof and take the tension, the weight off the wall so that you could put in this huge stained glass. And so this is it. And I got a cutaway here. This is a different cathedral. But what happened at Notre Dame was kind of what was happening here. This is the Amiens Cathedral, and it's high Gothic. And you see up here, timbers. And so when you take a look at Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, this is all wood. And the reason it caught on fire, as they said, was that this was wood, and it got, after 800, 900 years, wood will get pretty dry and very combustible. And they think that the fire was started by an electrical short. And that is that power lines that carry the electricity for the lighting and all of that stuff, even if they're insulated, even if it is wired properly, sometimes when they're used, they get warm. And sometimes the combustion point for those old timbers is actually pretty low. And so that is why it burned. And they're in the midst of restoring this. And so here, Virgin and Child, Notre Dame. And again, this is, I think it's worth noting that this is where that Virgin Mary, Mother of Christ, how the iconography changed over time. This is in the early 14th century, so it's in the early 1300s. And we have Jesus here, and he has an orb. He's come here to save the world. And so if anybody has any ideas that everybody believed the world was flat prior to Christopher Columbus, you can only take a look at this and see that this is the world. He has an orb, which is also a sign of royalty and authority. And so here she's holding a lily, which is significant. This is the Easter flower. This is a symbol of purity and goodness. And so in France, they don't call it a lily, they call it a lee. Anybody ever heard of fleur de lis? Well, fleur
Yes,
de
I've heard of it.
yeah, what is it? Tell me.
Isn't it just like we've seen it in the symbol of St. Louis, like
Yeah.
the flag, the fleur de lis, and
Yes, that's it.
and isn't like a symbol of like three petals, and they're especially known for their formal royal arms of France.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and as I was saying just a little while ago, in this day and age, there wasn't really a lot of distinction between, like you were saying, the symbol of France, the king of France, the flag of France, the army of France had the fleur de lis on their ships, on their uniforms. If you take a look at the New Orleans Saints, Louisiana, named after King Louis, Louisiana, they have the fleur de lis on their helmets. Yes, all of that. And this is where it comes from. It comes from this symbol of purity and goodness and Christianity and righteousness, and all of that gets tied in, and you're so right about that. And it persists on to this day. That's part of the, you'll see that image recur in royal pictures of all of the French kings, and just on and on. Like you said, it's part of the flag of St. Louis. And you see Mary has a crown. And so Christ is being thought of as royalty. And if he is Christ the King, which is an idea that is circulating in this period, but it's kind of more towards Greek Orthodox. They kind of look at Christ as a king. But if he's a king, his mother has to be the queen. And so, yeah, this is the iconography. This is how you read this stuff. And virgin and child and angels. There she is with a crown. There's the child. The angels are accompanying and protecting. And Christ, even at this young age, he's giving us a blessing. Up here, just told you about this one, the Holy Spirit, the dove. And that's kind of the construction plan of a lot of these high Gothic cathedrals. Nave elevations, you see they get bigger and bigger. Chartres, height of nave, 120 feet. Amiens is actually much, much larger, but was kind of a competition, get higher and better and closer to God. And so Reims Cathedral, well, just when you thought you had as much ornamentation as you could possibly get, they find ways. And so this is late 13th century. and the jams become even more crowded with statues of holy people, and the stories become much more elaborate and across the top. Yet more holy figures. And so bigger, higher, better. What do I keep saying this? Folding chairs. Yeah, back in the day, 13th century, you stood or knelt, but you didn't sit. And check this out. Look at how high. Looking at this from the inside. One of the things I have to mention just briefly is that these cathedrals, especially the ones in the eastern parts of France and Western Germany, they were threatened during the second and first, especially the First World Wars. They were right off of what became the battlefields. And some of these cathedrals in that area, some were accidentally bombed. A lot of them, they had to take the stained glass out of the cathedrals because of the shock of the cannon was destroying the stained glass. Anyway, that used to happen in this area too. We used to have sonic booms all over St. Louis when I was a kid. And loud noises can destroy glass, especially glass that's centuries old. Amiens Cathedral, Reims, you see, transept, more stained glass. Anyway, and as we get farther and farther into it, these statues, as I was saying, that began kind of stiff and kind of formulaic, actually start to develop much more in the way of personality. We're still not up to the kind of depictions we saw in ancient Greece and Rome, but it is changing. Sainte-Chapelle, this is 13th century, and look at how much they were able to take the weight off of the walls and put in stained glass. That stained glass does not hold weight. In fact, as I was saying, it's very fragile, but they find ways to distribute the weight. And as you might imagine, and I say this guardedly, but back in the day, back 700-800 years ago, if you were a person and you walked into something like this, and your existence didn't have, the idea of having images of any kind was kind of a rare thing. You come in here in a sunny day and these walls just light up with stories of the Bible. This is like I say guardedly, this is like going into IMAX or virtual reality or something. It was like, it was totally overwhelming. It was the kind of thing that would totally overwhelm the senses. And so when you saw this, there was no question. There is no question what is important to this culture. And as we see, this is in the 16th century. And it's still Gothic, partly because of the pointed archways and the steeple, and you can't see them here, but the flying buttresses and the kind of extreme ornamentation. And so anyway, this is an aerial view of the fortified town of Carsasson, anyway. And so anyway, this is kind of cool too, because this is how basically towns, cities existed in those days too, because they had to protect themselves from invaders, and they would have an outer fortification, an inner fortification, and then in the center, the most protected place being the place of worship. And here's another over here. So what you got is basically protecting. This is in Belgium. Hall of the Cloth Guild. And you can see ornamentation, reach up to the sky, tallest buildings they keep the record for centuries. This is in France. It's not just the cathedrals, the ornamentation, the archways, the glass. Blanche of Castile, Louis IX. That's our Louis. And it's part of a Bible. And here we have the scribes who made the Bible. There's King Louis. There's Blanche of Castile. Again, I told you a little bit about that with Hildegard of Bingen. We see Blanche of Castile. We see Teresa of Avila, Hildegard of Bingen, and so on. We start to see the emergence of holy women, which is kind of a cool thing. God as creator of the world. Tempera on vellum, 1 feet 1 inch, 13 by 13.5 by 8 1/4, basically the size of a legal pad. And again, the illuminated manuscripts, the Psalter of St. Louis prayer book. This all continues. This is something that starts in the Middle Ages. And again, for the most part, all of the artistic activity is dedicated to Christianity. We start to see Jean Pucelle, which he is a very famous manuscript artist, and he has a brother. They call them the Pucelle brothers, but bottom line, this is it. Betrayal of Christ. Figures based on geometric shapes. This is kind of proto Renaissance, but bottom line of this is, and we don't really know, but we still teach people how to draw like this. See the geometry in just about anything, and this is from the Abbey of Saint Denis. Again, Christ child, Virgin, and well, there's that fleur-de-lis, that lily that we were talking about, the symbol of purity, and it is associated with Mary, the mother of Christ. Castle of Love. And what's going on in the government? This is really kind of interesting too. This is jousting. And so kind of in the social structure of France, England, Germany, all of those places in Europe, they basically had a social hierarchy where the king and his family were on top, and just below them would be the hierarchy of the church, the bishops, and so on. And they had kind of a nepotistic idea of what would happen here. It's like a king and queen would have children. Their children would be royalty and heirs to the throne, but they typically devoted, one child would be designated to be in the priesthood, and a female child would be designated to be a nun, and another one would be designated to be a feudal lord over agriculture. And so what we have here is this kind of government, kind of high society that was really quite apart from everyday people. And so how they lived is pretty much depicted on this jewelry box. And so, anyway, I was telling you, this is Santa Maria from Leon, Spain. That's what I got confused on earlier. And you see all of the hallmarks of Gothic architecture. And so these things out here, those are buttresses. You don't see that so much on here, but world map. Mappa Mundi. Mundi means world. And so you see it is in a circle. And this is in the 13th century. One of the things that they did make a lot of maps, and a lot of those maps had to do with their trade routes and their connection to the Holy Lands. And usually the Holy Land would be in the center of all of this. So Jerusalem would be central. This, I'm sure, is the Mediterranean Sea and some of the major rivers and so on. But that was how they saw the world at that time. Salisbury, England. England has a wealth of Gothic cathedrals, each a little bit different in terms of style. Basically the same motivation, basically the same kind of cues, the vaulted, pointed archways, the sculpture. And these are shutters, by the way. This has stained glass windows as well. And the steeples reaching up into the heavens. And again, here's an example of a niche statue from England. And again, Bishop Poor. So, I wouldn't expect you guys to know this, but bottom line is that the people of the time would know who this was based on these other symbols. Of course, we see the mitre, which means that he is a bishop. We saw that on Saint Denis, by the way. And so the other indicators right out of what we've been talking about for a long time, iconography. And Salisbury Cathedral, folding chairs, I'm telling you about. Amazing. Amazing architecture. Scissors arches, which means that these kind of intersect with each other as scissors do at the fulcrum. Wells Cathedral, again, same idea, but you would know this by the stained glass, the arched windows, the immense sculptural decoration, and all of the other ornamentation on the building. Exeter Cathedral, folding chairs, again, check these out. So they do all kinds of magnificent things. Again, Gloucester Cathedral, the tomb of Edward II, and that is something that's really a part of these cathedrals as well, is that they become, in a sense, a lot of people are buried in these cathedrals as well, sometimes out in the open, sometimes under the cathedral. The Saint Denis, I was looking for a photo of this. He's buried in the Cathedral of Saint Denis, and they have, just like this has this kind of sarcophagus with an image on top. As we know, it comes all the way from Etruscan art. But yeah, on that sarcophagus, there is Denis holding his head. Vaults from the chapel of Henry VII. So we're in the 16th century, and it just gets more and more elaborate. The exterior of the chapel of Henry VII. We got some German examples here. This is an altar. The Abbey Church at Klosterneuburg. Sacrifice of Isaac. We know this iconography too. There's Isaac. There's Abraham. There's the angel stopping Abraham at the last moment. And see, a lot of this written in Roman, so you don't really, it's hard to read. Some of it's in ancient Old Greek too, but we know Isaac is on there. And so anyway, bottom line, Shrine of Three Kings, again, what we see, excessive ornamentation. Death of the Virgin, tympanum of Strasbourg Cathedral. One of the things I got to say here, and I was telling you about the problems they had in the First World War with a lot of those cathedrals being close to the Rhine River, which is kind of the modern day border between France and Germany. And again, like I say, cities pop up around freshwater sources, which the Rhine certainly is. But that area over the centuries became German, became French, became German again. And so we see over time, some places in France have a German name and vice versa. Cologne, for example. 13th century. Crucifixion. Wanted to kind of maybe end on this idea. And you see, one of the things that develops, and especially in Germany, is the idea of a Christ who suffered. Now, we don't see that so much in Byzantine art, and we didn't see that for a long time. And a lot of people were very reluctant to show a Christ who died because, in the catechism, we say Christ never died. He went to heaven and he returned from heaven and ascended back into heaven. But the idea of a vulnerable Christ that was tortured, quite literally, that's something that becomes part of the way Christians practiced their religion and how they saw Jesus. Why am I going on about this? Because if you guys take World Art and Ideas 2, it'll begin with Italian Renaissance. And the Italians kind of take a different view of Christ. In the North, it's about Christ's sufferings. In the South, it's a different story. And it's one of the differences that leads to the rise of Protestantism, by the way. And so, some more cathedrals, statues, so on. There I was talking about, there are the Cologne Cathedral, Cologne, Germany. So we have this French name for a German city. Just say it, goes back and forth. Again, 13th century, extremely, has all the hallmarks of Gothic cathedrals. St. Elizabeth in Germany. You see this one not quite as ornamented. The Church of the Holy Cross, and that's all I have. So, and so, any questions? What time is it? Oh, it's 1:35. We're on time. Any questions? Any?
So the direction changed on our presentations, just been down to 7 minutes, and all the rest has stayed the same based on the content material and everything else.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question.
What
So
is it?
for our quiz on Thursday, we're going to have to write about our topic.
Yeah.
Will we have to find sources?
It's on Wednesday, but yes. Yes, and it's going to be an opinion question.
Okay. I haven't started on the PowerPoint project yet. I haven't had time.
Well, you got about 48 hours till I asked you a question about it. So at least think about it.
So what date is the project due?
When we come back, November 30th.
Okay, good to know.
Okay. Well, guys, see you on Wednesday.